Hello, welcome to the ADORNit online class. I'm Janet and I'm going to be talking to you today about our hip to be square quilt that you can see hanging behind me. This is a fun, easy quilt project that you can buy as a kit through Barnes & Noble, or you can purchase through ADORNit, either as a kit or you can buy your own fabrics, and we have the pattern available. Basically, if you can sew a straight line and cut a straight line, you've got this quilt figured out, because that's all it is. It's really simple. The squares that are in the center of the quilt are constructed like a log cabin square, and that again is very simple, but I will talk you through doing the log cabin squares, and then we'll talk a little bit about the squares that you can see hopefully behind me, and I'll show you in just a minute, that have some of our fabric that's super popular that has calligraphy on it or writing on it, and that is directional, and so there's a good way to cut those if you want all of the words to go in the same direction. But let's start with a square that the direction doesn't matter first. So we're going to do a square that looks like this. In your kit you will have everything that you need to cut the center squares, which are these two fabrics. So you'll cut 5.5-inch squares of those two fabrics, and then you'll cut your strips to surround each of those squares in the completed quilt. And the strips are 3 inches wide, so you're just going to lay your fabric. When a pattern says to cut a certain dimension by the width of fabric, they mean from the fold to the selvage. So you'll lay your fabric out, you'll measure 3 inches, because that's how wide these strips are that you need to cut. And then you're going to cut all the way from the fold to the selvage, and you'll do that twice. And that will give you enough fabric for 2 squares that are surrounded with this blue fabric. You'll need 2 strips in order to complete 2 squares. And I believe in the quilt there are 2 squares of each fabric surrounding. There's 2. Okay. Your pattern will give you dimensions for how long to cut each of these strips. This one obviously is 5.5 inches, the same as the square. And then the next one you'll sew on will be this one, and then it needs to be longer because you need the 5.5 inches from the square as well as the 3 inches from the top piece that you sewed on previously. So you can follow the directions on your pattern, but there's a fast way that's my favorite way to do a log cabin quilt, and this only works if the direction, if this fabric is not directional. If it doesn't matter which way it goes, then the quickest way to do this would be trim off your selvage, and this is my favorite way to do it because I'm all about fast. Then you'll take your square, lay the whole strip, just match up one corner and one edge, and sew that on right along that top with a 1/4 inch seam. Then pull it out of your sewing machine, and then you're going to trim it even. So it might be easier to do it this way. So you've sewed it on. You're going to take your little ruler and just trim that strip even with the square. And it will look like this. So these are different fabrics, but there you can see I've sewed my first strip on. And then you'll take it to your ironing board and press the seam allowance to one side or the other. It doesn't matter. Just press the seam allowance. Then you're ready. So you've sewed this. You're going to open it out, pretend it's sewed together. Now you can take your strip again. And you're going to do the strip on the right side. So match up the corners, match up the sides, take it to your sewing machine, sew a 1/4 inch, trim it off, and then you'll press out that piece. And then just work your way around the square. and just keep using, one strip will be enough to do around 1 5-inch square width, and you'll have extra. And so when you're done, and then the last piece goes all the way across, you have your log cabin finished square that looks like that. So that is so easy. If you like to be particular and you want to cut your strips ahead of time, follow the measurements in your pattern and cut the strips ahead of time, and then just sew them on in the same manner that I just did. Now, if your fabric that's surrounding your square is directional, like this fabric with the writing is, then it's a little more tricky, but not impossible. And we have 2 fabrics like that in this quilt. One of them where the writing goes straight across, and one of them where the writing is on an angle. And it's the same principle for each one. So your fabric's going to look like this when you get it. Fold and selvage. I've trimmed off the selvage here. I've actually trimmed off more than the selvage, but you get the idea. You'll lay your fabric out on your cutting table with the fold down at the bottom and the selvages at the top. Then the instructions will tell you that you need to cut 2 strips that are 3 inches by 5.5 inches. That's this strip right here. Then you're going to cut 2 strips, and this is enough for 2 squares. 2 strips 3 inches by 8 inches, and that's going to be this strip right here. Then you're going to do that again, and it's that strip right there. But these strips have to be cut separately from these strips because the writing is going the other direction. My advice to you is cut the longest strip first that's going the other direction. So where it says cut 2 strips 3 inches by 10.5 inches, the writing needs to read left to right along the 3-inch width. So to do that, you're going to need to turn your fabric this way or this way. And now, as I'm looking at my fabric, the fabric reads from left to right. It's on an angle, but it's still reading from left to right. The words are reading from left to right. Same thing with the, well, you can't see it on that because I've already cut it. But if it was this fabric, the words would read straight across from left to right. So you'll want to cut your longest strip going that direction first. So you'll cut your 10-inch by 3-inch strip that way. Then you can turn it back this way and cut your strips where the writing goes the long way down the strip, and it's all in your instructions. And then you'll do 2 more this way and 2 more this way. Hopefully that makes sense to you, and you can see when you're done that I have a strip I'll try to do this upside down. All you're looking for is for the writing to be running the same direction. The actual words are both, they go both up and down. Okay, now see how that's not right? And that's not right. So you need a different strip, which I probably have around here somewhere, but not right here. And then for your final long piece, oh, here we go. Okay, so just be careful before you sew that you make sure all of your words are going the same direction. And like I said, the instructions talk you through that, and so it's not very hard. But these pieces are easier to cut separately before you sew them on, and then you'll sew them on and have a piece that's where all the writing is going in the same direction. When you're done cutting or sewing your blocks together, if you have a little extra, you'll match up one edge and sew along. If there's a little bit of extra, that is not a problem. Just take your cutter and your ruler and trim off that little tail. And you'll actually want to trim all of these squares. You'll trim them up after you're done sewing them all, and I would sew them all first, and then trim them all so that they are uniform in size. And you want it'll be about 10 inches square, maybe 10 1/4 inches square. But you'll just take them to your cutting table, trim them all so that they're exactly square using a ruler, and so that they're all the same size. Okay, and then once you get all of your squares completed, you've pretty much got it made. You'll lay them out in the design that you want, or you can follow the pattern and lay them out the way that's shown on the pattern, and then you'll just sew each square together. So you'll sew these two squares together, right sides together, the 1/4 inch seam, and then press the seam allowances open, and you'll do that, and then you'll do the same thing with this square, and then press the seam allowances open, and then you'll do the same thing for all of the rows going across, and then sew all of the rows together down the length of the quilt, and then just be sure when you're doing that that you match up the seam. So when you sew 2 rows like this together, you'll lay them right sides together and carefully match that seam and the edges. That's why it's important that the squares all be this exact same size before you start sewing them together. So you'll complete all of the rows and sew the whole center section of the quilt together. And that is basically it. At that point, you've just about got it done. Then you're going to just take the other fabrics that you'll have in your kit and cut straight cuts by width of fabric. It will tell you how many you need to do the little narrow red border, and that's just a straight sew onto the sides and to the tops of the quilt. So you'll sew little narrow borders along each side and then along the top and bottom. Same thing with the yellow border. Very simple, straight strips, sew them to the sides and to the top and bottom. The only tricky thing is the border around the outside, because again, that's a directional stripe. When you're cutting the strips out of this stripe fabric for the wide outer border for your quilt, if you want the strips to go the direction they're going on the quilt, then those will not be cut by the width of fabric. Those will be cut by the length of fabric. So you'll go by your pattern. It tells you how long to cut your strips, and then you'll cut them this way when you're cutting. And it's generally easier to fold the fabric in half, trim off your selvages, and then cut your strips this way so that when you sew them on the quilt, they're going perpendicular to the body of the quilt. And again, straight stitching, nothing hard. When you're done, you layer your quilt top and your batting and your backing, and you can have it machine quilted, or if you're an old school girl, you can hand quilt. That's really fun to do as well. And then just bind the quilt and you're done. And it is adorable, and it'd be so cute on the end of the bed or anywhere in your house that you need a little adorable accent. So we hope you try this project. If you make one, we'd love to have you post it to our Facebook page. We'd also love to have you subscribe to the ADORNit YouTube channel so you don't miss any of our fun tutorials and videos and cute projects. And thank you so much for joining us.